Hey, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Cool Sports Network. I am your host, Chase Coburn. The NBA season is just around the corner, and to preview this coming NBA season and what it has in store, we are joined by award winning analyst for MSG Networks and ESPN, Hahn. Alan, thanks so much for coming on. Welcome to the show.
Glad we could do this, Chase. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you as well. I'm so glad that you are able to be here. Again, the NBA season is here. It's October. We were talking before. It's still warm in October here in the Northeast area, but it is October. The NBA season begins tomorrow. Before we preview what it all has in store, when did you realize you wanted to be a broadcaster, and what has been your career path since to get to the point where you're at now?
Well, I mean, my story's a little bit different than everybody else's because really, when I graduated college, my focus was being a sports writer. Like, that's all I thought about, that's all I cared about. And so I was able to do that. And I was a beat writer for many years. I was a columnist for a while, and I was covering the Knicks and started doing some things TV-wise for MSG Network. And it just, one thing led to another. It was offered to me to do some studio work for them and leave sports writing, which was not an easy decision to make, but I did. It was a bit of a risk at that point in my career, but I just thought I wanted the next challenge. So it wasn't as if I had gone to school for it. I really didn't. But I learned as I went. I learned from a lot of really good people in the business, and I also learned a lot about how a writing foundation is actually a really vital part of broadcasting. And so that helped me acclimate a lot faster than normally. And
Right.
learning all the other stuff about it, the cameras and, all that stuff, and having somebody talk to you while you're talking, in your ear, your producers, all that stuff you get used to. But it really was one of those opportunities that came my way, and I couldn't say no. I did it, and I've just kind of been evolving with it ever since. So it's been like a second career for me.
It really has been. It's incredible you were able to make that transition. And obviously, you're just so good on the air. So I think it's good that you did make that transition. We love hearing you on ESPN and MSG networks and all the places that you are shown. You've won several awards for broadcasting. You've covered some of the biggest sports in the world. You've done so many incredible things throughout your career already. Is there one moment in particular that stands out amongst the rest? And you're like, wow, I think that's my favorite moment ever in this industry?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was sort of a turning point for me, but it was one of those moments where I realized, like, okay, I'm in it. And I mean, there's two moments that really stick with me, but the one moment that I'll never forget, because it was a night that I couldn't sleep, and it was back in 2010. LeBron James was a free agent for the first time, and everybody in the league wanted him. It was a huge offseason. Yeah, it was. Yeah, right, exactly. Especially a prime, young LeBron
Right.
James. And so, and it had been building up for 2 years. There were teams like the Knicks were one, but there were others too. They were dumping salary, gathering draft picks, whatever they could do to have enough cap space and ability to sign him and maybe other stars and create a new situation for him and get him out of Cleveland. And so the buildup was there, and I was still a sports writer at the time. And so that summer, that off season, I should say, going into the playoffs, wherever Cleveland went, I went. Wherever LeBron was, I was. And I was around a lot for the month of June and into July when his tour of free agency began, where he was meeting with teams. And it was just unbelievable, to be part of sort of this entourage of people covering this one person and this big decision. And I happened to have enough sources and connections with some people that gave me the story. I broke the story of the choice he was going to make, that he was going to announce the next day on a nationally televised show on ESPN that he was going to have, and this is where he's going. They called the show The Decision, but the night before the show, I broke the story that he would be going to Miami. And boy, I'll tell you what, a lot of people were mad about that. A lot of writers who were fighting for that scoop were trying to disparage it. Oh, that's, he hasn't made a decision yet, and all those things. Anything they could do to make sure that the story stayed alive. And I said, no, this is where he's going. His handlers, his managers, his agents were not happy about it. And so my phone never stopped ringing from the moment that I put out a tweet and the moment I wrote the story. Even my own editors were kind of nervous about it because no one else in the country had it. But I was pretty confident in my sources. So I didn't sleep that whole night. And I'm telling you, that was one of those like, yeah, you're in it. Like this is what it's like when you're, when you're breaking a story of this magnitude. And it's like whole country is, if you read some of the comments in the tweet that I posted, it's hysterical. People are like, who is this guy? How would he know? Stuff like that. So it was quite a night. And obviously it ended up being accurate, which I was not hesitant at all. He did announce that he was going to Miami. And did I take an exhale? Absolutely I did. But I was confident, but you're not confident until the moment it happens. So that whole 24 hours, and then I was actually on MSG that night of when he made the announcement. We did a show off of it as well because he didn't choose the Knicks. And that really did push my career into TV because of all that stuff. So it's one of those moments I'll never forget. Other one is more recent, and the other one was last season. Jalen Brunson was named an All-Star for the first time before a game against the Pacers at the Garden. Then he played this game, and they had an unbelievable comeback. He was insane. He was so good. The crowd was just cheering for him and chanting MVP and all that stuff. And I interviewed him on the court, not only for TV, but they also played it in the arena. And I paused because the crowd was just so emotionally connected to him. And he started to tear up. And I just stopped and let the moment happen. And it was one of my favorite moments because it was so organic and yet so genuine. And it was kind of cool to be part of. And then he finally was able to say a few words, and the place was just going crazy. And the minute I walked off the court with him and he was done, my phone just blew up with so many people that just said, that was amazing. That was just so incredible. And I didn't really know it at the time because I was in the midst of the interview. So I watched it back later and I got caught up in it like, wow, that really was a cool moment. So, that's a more recent one that I'll never forget. But that LeBron free agency story and that night and all the intensity of the coverage and the exhaustion of traveling around and working to get the story, then getting the story. And it felt like the biggest win, of my career. Like when you're a reporter, you are trying to win, you are competing with other people. Right. And it just felt really good to get that win.
It's interesting how you brought up like getting that win in the competition, because I've spoken to a lot of reporters and writers, and they're like, we're all trying to like help each other in a sense. Sometimes, people know each other from different companies, especially if they're covering the same sport or the same team. But there is a level of competition. You always want to get that next role. You always want to get that next spot, that next report, that next news story. And the fact that you were able to do that was absolutely incredible. Was there a moment where you were a little concerned? I know you said you trusted your sources, but like, if say it was wrong, did you feel like your credibility was about to go? Because I've spoken with guys like Adam Schefter, and they're like, you really have to be careful with what you report, especially before it becomes official in other areas.
You're 100% right, and that was for me like the confidence that I had in putting it out there because of the confidence I had in the people that I had talked to. And it wasn't as if I had only one person. I actually followed up with somebody else of high regard, and they kind of gave me the same, like, I heard that. And so I'm like, okay, so there's something real here. And then corroborating some of the information of, how it all went down. So I felt good. And then also getting not a denial, but one of those like, he could change his mind from one of his people had me going, okay, so like I'm feeling good about this. And so I go with it. And it wasn't until first my editor, because the paper gets involved when it's something of this magnitude, because you're saying something that is a national story. So they get involved, and now they want to know your sources. And I'm very careful with what I say because, while it's your editors and stuff, I don't like ever saying this is who I got it from, because you never want that to get out. So that was a big fight for me. So I was going through some anxiety of, hey, just trust me. How do you not trust me? Well, You need to tell us who told you. I said, I can't do that. Like, not until after it's over. Then I'll tell you. But, like, I'm not going to do it. So that to me was the part that had me the most kind of on edge. I was never worried that he was going to come out and say, I'm staying in Cleveland. That's what one of his guys actually said to me. He could wake up tomorrow and change his mind. And I'm like, yeah, but he's not, because like I had known, here's one thing, Chase, I'll tell you. One of the things I heard, and this was also one of the things when I say corroborating information, this was something that when I was at, okay, yeah, I'm good, is that in Miami, they had already planned that party that they had with Wade and Bosh and LeBron on the stage. They were planning it. Like they were setting up for this thing that they did that night after the decision. So I was like, okay, like we're not planning this whole thing if he's not part of it. So, that's all the little things that go into it. I felt confident, and he wouldn't change his mind in the morning if there was already that kind of planning going on. So I felt good, but I was anxious about having to reveal a source I didn't want to, especially one in particular. And also the amount of vitriol that I was receiving, because there was this fear, LeBron being a big player, this is an agency now that wouldn't be happy with you doing this and ruining their big party and their big secret and their big show, that come back to negatively affect me on other stories later. But I couldn't worry about it because I felt like, you know what? There's no bigger fish than this one.
Right.
So I'd rather have this and miss out on something later than, it's kind of be compromised as a reporter and give this one away just to have some other smaller stories later. So I dug in, but it was definitely a sleepless night.
Journalism is definitely a tough job. You have to weigh I guess you could say the pros and cons in a sense of doing something. But I still kind of find that whole thing to be so strange, how no one else has ever gone on national television and explained or said where they're going. And it was just really an intense time. And I think that's why obviously the story was so important. And you mentioned like that magnitude of it. That was incredible. Let's go to the current day. We're currently recording this October 21st, 2024, a day away from the NBA season. I don't know if it's just me, but I am very, very excited for what this year has in store. You mentioned you do a lot with the Knicks and MSG networks. They made some huge moves during the offseason. Last year, they made that jump to become the number 2 seed, kind of into that really big contention level, though they fell short of the conference finals. Blame injuries all you want, but it was just a little bit of a tough road once they got to the second round against Indiana. They made huge moves. Trading for Mikal Bridges, you trade for Karl Anthony Towns. They have to part ways with some pieces, but both of those moves should be able to help them. How do you think those moves do help their chances of getting past Boston and other teams in the Eastern Conference and making a run at the NBA title? And what are your overall expectations for the Knicks in 2024?
I've said since the Towns trade, I just believe that, and then obviously the Bridges trade is part of now the makeover of a roster that got to the semifinal, really one game from the conference finals. They did run out of gas. They did have a lot of injuries that just took them out. And I said that those moves have now put them on par with just about any other starting five in the NBA. Absolutely. And if you think about it matching up wise with, like, for instance, Boston, who they struggled to beat. Boston has an addition that they made that made them just the championship they are, is Kristaps Porzingis. The Knicks didn't have anybody that could really counter that. They do now. Embiid, while they did beat the Sixers, Embiid was on one leg and still averaged 30 and 12, right?
Yeah.
Like, so they didn't really have an answer for him. They were able to beat them because he just didn't have anything in the tank by the fourth quarter. But you still have to always say to yourself, if we see him again in a playoff series, they added Paul George, like, you can't just assume, well, we're just better than them. So this now gives them a piece that also puts them on par with a lineup like that. I think the Milwaukee Bucks, I think the Miami Heat, you have a lot of versatility with that starting five that just on paper should make you better than them. Offensively, this should be one of the best Knick offenses that we've seen in a long time. It should be. Now, what did they compromise, though, Chase? They compromised grit, defense, and rebounding. And that's the stuff. If you're saying, like, the expectations, I want to see how this develops over time. It might take a while. Like everybody wants this to be instant gratification and come out of the gate and win 20 straight games. I just, I think it's going to take a minute for everybody to figure it out. And I just think by playoffs, I think they will. And I just feel like talent-wise, this is as good a roster as they've had in a real long time, and it does match up with just about anybody in the league.
You mentioned kind of losing that defensive ability, and I think one of the key things about the New York Knicks and any team under Tom Thibodeau, for that matter, is they don't always need to be the most talented, but they need to work the hardest. The Knicks have been one of the best defensive teams. Wow, you look at a guy like Josh Hart, plays like all 48 minutes, smaller forward, could get 15 rebounds if he has to in a playoff game. Like it is that grit and that physicality that the Knicks bring to the table, or again any team under Thibodeau, that makes them so great. I do wonder, as you just said, if compromising a little bit of that for talent will actually hurt them, considering that's really not the culture that they've set.
Yeah, and that's going to be interesting to watch. And that's, of course, the guys who are there from last year have to make sure that standard is upheld. That, hey, let's not forget who we are, though, as an identity. I think that's what fans fell in love with last year's team, because they were like that. They were the grinders,
right?
That they would just outwork some teams. That later in a game, when other teams started to get tired and started to falter, the Knicks did not. The Knicks were a team that, if it looked like they were on the brink, like I couldn't remember a game where they got blown out. It just never happened. They just never, they took all your punches. They might have lost the game, but they never were blown out, because they were just a resilient team that refused to give in. And so I want to make sure that identity doesn't go away. And that, of course, is up to the guy. Again, you mentioned Hart, great example of somebody that should be upholding the standard. Brunson, obviously, is the captain. Anunoby was around for at least half a year. He certainly, the way he gets after defensively, that's the kind of stuff. And now they add, they lose DiVincenzo, but they add a guy like Cameron Payne, who has been around the league a while. He's been in the league 10 years. Real gritty, hard-working kind of player who really plays with a lot of passion and fire. And so you're hoping that addition does keep the momentum of that gritty team. Bench comes in and they're going to scratch and claw and fight with you, where a lot of teams don't always have that on their bench. So, that's what I'm watching. I'm definitely watching that part of it, because that's the team that everybody fell in love with. I don't know if they're going to be that same team, though, that they were last year.
They open their season Tuesday night, or tomorrow night, I should say, against the Boston Celtics, the reigning champions. I mean, they had one of the most dominant seasons in a long time last year, and they're pretty much keeping the exact same core. Do you see Boston being just as dominant as they were last year, with a roster that looks pretty much identical? And then remember, last year they cakewalked basically through the entire postseason. Do you think we could see that again for Boston, or do you think they're going to have some more troubles?
Well, the one thing that Boston had, and they took advantage of it, but they was, think about all the teams they played in the playoffs. Milwaukee wasn't Milwaukee, right? Like Miami, like their side of the bracket was not challenging, really. By the time Indiana got there, you saw Indiana just was completely overmatched when they got there. Like Indiana getting to the conference finals was a great story for Indiana, but you could argue that they really had no business being there. But the Knicks had beaten the Sixers, so they're out of the way. And then the Knicks, with all their injuries, couldn't get out of a 7-game series with the Pacers. So if you're the Boston Celtics, the last thing you wanted to do was see the Knicks or the Sixers. Instead, you saw a young Pacers team that, just wasn't ready for the moment. Their game one execution stands out late in the game. They couldn't hold leads, like a lot of stuff that young teams go through. So for Boston, it fell into place so perfectly. And then they get to the finals, and if they had played Minnesota, I guarantee you they might not have had an easy time. If they played Denver, I don't think they would have had an easy time. Not to say that the Dallas Mavericks didn't belong there and that Luka Doncic isn't a scary player, but when you're considering all the different matchups that you could have had, Dallas was exactly the kind of team that they probably wanted to see. So it really worked out. Doesn't take away from their championship, doesn't take away from their great season. But they definitely are a team that I feel like is not going to come into this season with this sense of accomplishment, or how, okay, we've got our like a lot of times a team wins a championship, they almost take a step back. It's very strange how it's like complacency sets in. That can happen, But this team, I feel like, carries a chip because Jaylen Brown was MVP, but yet couldn't play in the Olympics. Jason Tatum didn't get off the bench a lot in the Olympics, and he couldn't even win MVP. And everybody talked about how you're not even the best player on your team. Like, there was so much for a team that won a championship, so many little needles that could poke you into, okay, I still got something to prove, clearly, that I still feel like they're going to have that kind of grind to them to try to repeat, just to shut up all of the people that don't believe in them, think you had an easy path, this was too easy, that you're not that good. I think they still have something to prove. So that's what makes them a dangerous team, is that it won't be the complacency that you normally see. The only thing is they'll be without Porzingis for the first couple of months because of his injury, and how much will they miss that, because he was such a big part of what they did.
He really was. You mentioned this like complacency though, and like teams taking a step back after they win a championship. A lot of people blame parity for the fact that there's been 6 different champions over the past 6 years. Maybe you just blame NBA teams. Like I think a lot of teams. You're right. I think Boston is the first team in a while that like stopped having. Or that didn't stop having a lot of doubters even after the championship. Like Milwaukee won the championship, everyone shut up. Golden State won the championship. We kind of have been giving them the benefit of the doubt over the past few years, even though their roster hasn't been good. Everyone thought Denver was like going to repeat without losing a game after they won. Like Boston is like that only team that I feel like has to prove people again after winning a championship, which is absurd. You mentioned the schedule that they had in the playoffs, but it really is crazy how they have to prove themselves again.
No, I just was laughing because you're right. You're making a great point. It's true. Like, you just went through the teams that had won, like, again, the Giannis finally breaking through, Jokic finally breaking through, and everybody just, that's what's supposed to happen. Okay, good. He finally got it. And yet the Celtics win with Tatum and Brown, who've been together forever. They've been to the conference finals 3 times prior. They have never been able to get over the hump. They've been criticized for that inability to get over the hump. They finally get over the hump. They get the championship, and no one's satisfied. It's a really good point.
It really is. And I think the interesting part, what makes it really exciting, is not only is the reigning champion still fighting hard to repeat, but other teams are fighting harder to make sure that they don't have that easy of a time like they did last year. Teams have been trying to get better. We saw a lot of huge offseason moves, whether that's a trade or a signing during the offseason. Which of those moves do you think is kind of underrated in a sense, that's kind of going unnoticed, that could turn out to be a huge move in hindsight?
That's a great question, because everybody's going to want to point to Paul George and the Sixers and them being all in with Embiid and trying to make it work. And I got to be honest with you. I'm going to go with one that might have been more under the radar, but one that I'm watching, because if you looked at one team last year that was really good, that felt like they were on the cusp, but might have been missing one element, I think the Oklahoma City Thunder adding Alex Caruso to their bench and Isaiah Hartenstein.
Huge, yeah.
I think when you ask, like, what were they missing? Grit, experience, a little more toughness and depth. That they were toe-to-toe with the Dallas Mavericks, toe-to-toe with them in that series. So what were they missing? I think that's what they were missing. They were a young team that the youth was exposed when it really got to the nitty-gritty. And Caruso's a vet. He's won a championship with the Lakers. He's toughness. He knows the coach very well. They go back. Hardenstein, I know he broke his hand. They're going to miss him a little bit, but he's showed you in New York how tough he can be.
Yes. Big
moments he never shied away from. So those were terrific additions for a Thunder team that was already number 1 in the West last year. Who's to say they'll do it again this year? They could be that team that nobody wants to play in the West now.
I think it's correct, because you look at what they had last year, and that was just a really talented roster. But again, missing that defense, that grit, a lot of those things you mentioned, Caruso and Hartenstein really fit what they needed. And I think even in all sports, right? I'm a Baltimore Orioles fan, and I felt like they're a contender right now, and they've have not made the right moves, signing veterans to kind of get them to that next step. I get they traded for Corbin Burns, but like some of the problems about having too young of a lineup and stuff, they haven't really fixed that. I think the Thunder are one of the rare examples of young teams, finally in that contention mode, that are making the right moves to try to get to that next step. And I think it's incredible that we saw that.
Yeah, and it's easier said than done because too many times when we watch young teams who want to add, you tend to see them add like you need a brand name. You got to get a brand. No, you don't. What you need are those guys that have been in the league a long time, that have been winners a long time. They don't have to be the brand names. You don't have to add a superstar. You have to add the vets who get it, who understand, who you could put around a young talented team and not overwhelm them with your presence, but support them with your experience. For a general manager, that is hard to do because you could bring in some vets who are tough and gritty, and they can ruin your locker room. Like it's very delicate how you do it. But Caruso obviously is not that kind of personality. Neither is Hartenstein. So that's brilliant moves, and I'm really curious to see what it does for the Thunder because they were already one of the best teams in the West. They just were missing something, and this might be it.
One of the other huge moves that the NBA has made, because fans have started to lose interest over an 82-game regular season, it's become less and less important thanks to this incredible surge in offensive production and load management. They said, you know what, let's add an in-season tournament. Let's spice it up. But I think a lot of fans had something different in mind after they saw how it turned out last year. Do you feel the in-season tournament has been doing the job that it was set out to do?
I think once it got going, the beginning was a little weird. The courts, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think once you got into where the games meant something, like, hey, they got to win this game so they can advance, I think that's when suddenly there was a little something extra to it. And so I don't think it missed completely. I felt like the novelty was a bit much. That's my opinion. I'm an old guy, though. They're really trying to focus on your generation. They want to get your eyeballs on it. So they're creating like the interesting courts, the uniforms. They want it to be a little something extra. But for me, I'm more traditionalist. So I see that stuff and I'm like, yeah, who needs all this, right? But when we got to a point when the games did have some meaning to it, like, hey, if they win this game, they're now in first place in the pool, or they got to win this game to stay tied for first place in the pool. They want to advance. Like, oh, they get this matchup, whatever it is. Anytime you're playing for something, when it matters, now there's a little something extra. And I felt that in some of the games. And you can't tell me that when, the Lakers and Pacers got together, the Lakers really seemed to buy into it and enjoy it. And I was there in LA when they revealed the banner for winning the first in-season tournament. And I can tell you this too, Chase. I was walking from the court into the locker room area, the Lakers locker room area, on the floor, painted on the floor, walking into the Laker locker room was a big in-season tournament logo and a Lakers logo, and it said 2023, 2024 champions. And I thought, well, they care enough about it to do all this. It's got to mean something.
Right.
So I think, I think I like the idea. I think it worked. And I think the more see it year after year, it'll start to have like a purpose.
Let's transition now to some teams that may care about the in-season tournament more and more, teams that may not be able to make a push towards the NBA championship. We saw there was a huge Victor Wembanyama race a few years ago. Now there is a huge Cooper Flag race currently going on in the NBA. One of those teams is the Washington Wizards. I have a podcast about them, Wiz Talk with Chase. We do a lot of great stuff over there, interview people about the Wizards, talk about some of their moves, some of their games. And they haven't made the conference finals since 1979. It's been a rough time in the nation's capital for basketball. But now the ownership, they seem to finally be taking a step back and letting the front office do their job and rebuild this basketball team, something they refused to do in the previous years. Do you feel the moves that Washington has made and the direction that the franchise is going in as a whole will pay off eventually?
The one thing I like that they did was allow Brian Keefe to stay as the coach. Because when you're trying to reset a franchise, you have to start with one thing, and that is an accountability, right? You have to have a coach that has the ability to coach his players hard and to demand what he demanded out of them. When he took over, like you saw it, like now the winning didn't follow immediately because there's still some roster issues there. But I've known Brian Keefe a little bit. I like how he just kind of came in and, okay, look, we're going to have a standard first. So let's start with that.
The players
and you started getting something out of Jordan Poole. Yeah, oh yeah, no, you see that. Like getting something out of Jordan Poole was the first job. And a lot of people said you can't. Oh, it'll never work. Well, he started getting something out of Jordan Poole. That's important. Kyle Kuzma. Originally, everybody thought he was going to try to play his way out of there and get traded. He didn't want to get traded. No, like he's all set. So they've got at least the most important step is a bit of a foundation. Okay, this is who we are. They are going to need a real legit, like high level star. And you're not going to attract one in free agency. So they're going to have to draft them. That's the hardest part. Because especially like this draft coming up, not only do you have Cooper Flagg, but the kid Ace Bailey at Rutgers, I've been told by everybody, is going to, like, if Flagg is the easy number one pick, Ace Bailey could go number one and nobody would bat an eye. He's that good. You know, there's serious talent at the very top of this draft. The lottery, however, makes it so difficult because it's a complete crapshoot. So you can't say, oh, we'll just tank and get a high draft pick, because as we've seen in the past, it doesn't always work out. Ask the Detroit Pistons.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you do as an organization other than, I think, what they're doing, which is let's do this honestly. Let's do this the right way. Make sure you keep developing your players. But the reality, I think, is that the Wizards are going to need some magic. That's how it's got to work. Now, we thought that worked for them when they got John Wall and then got Bradley Beal. But once again, I do think what was missing there was still a standard and an accountability. And obviously, Wall's injuries didn't help either. So I really, really think that in the NBA, if you really want to turn your franchise around, the things that happen generally are player related. You get a player that suddenly becomes, oh, this guy's legit. And, you know, like, look at the Thunder. The Thunder didn't draft Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. They were able to get him because another team wanted one of their players so desperately, they were willing to give up a draft pick, a young player for him. And you saw the potential in that player. We talk about the Knicks. Look at Jalen Brunson. Jalen Brunson completely rejuvenated a long-lost franchise. He was a bench player off of a Dallas team that didn't want to pay him what he thought his value was. And the Knicks took him, and he became not just he's a nice player, an all-star. He's a top 5 MVP pick, and he became a generational player for them. So for the Wizards, that's kind of the next thing. Find a guy that comes in that room, and suddenly everybody starts to believe.
Let's go rapid fire here before we hear your NBA championship pick, which I know a lot of the teams, or a lot of the people listening to this, would love to hear as we near the NBA season. But before we get to that, let's go rapid fire here. Which team do you see making a massive leap, and which team do you see falling off compared to their success last year?
Oh, that's a great question. The massive leap and the falling off. I think the Miami Heat fall off. And I know they were falling off last year too, but I think it's starting to slip there a little bit.
Yeah.
And the Jimmy Butler thing will be a story to watch this season. Hard to say that because like the Heat have become like the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? Spoelstra is just like Mike Tomlin. Every year he finds a way. Like, you know, they're never going to be bad. But when I'm looking at the East, I just look and I think to myself, like, I don't know, like teams are getting better and better. And, you know, that I just don't know if Miami with Jimmy Butler, until they figure out a future away from him, how much they'll be able to move on. The massive leap one, I think, this might sound cliche, but it's the San Antonio Spurs. They've got everything. They're still very young. Chris Paul is a smart addition when it comes to the locker room stuff. Wembanyama is just such an amazing talent. Yeah. You also have a head coach who knows what the hell he's doing. And I just think they were a team that in the second half, they just got better and better and better. And now that Wembanyama has the confidence in himself and he's figured out the league pretty quickly, I find it hard-pressed that they won't be a team that's at the just fighting to get themselves into the play-in. I think they could be there. The West is tough, but, man, he's so good. And that roster isn't as bad as you think. And they have a great coach.
I honestly really like that Spurs pick. I think the Chris Paul addition was huge. And I understand what you're saying about Miami. I do think they're bound to fall off at some point. They made the finals a few years ago as the eighth seed. Like, I feel like they haven't been really dominant. They've just had a good postseason, I guess, success and
Right.
history. But if they can't get to the postseason, obviously they can't do that. And I think the Eastern Conference will become more and more competitive. The
Yeah.
NBA
My
season,
other choice, I'll tell you what, my other choice could have been the Milwaukee Bucks. Because that's,
they're
if you
interesting
could
to me
really
for sure. They
debate,
dealt with injuries, yeah.
yeah, you could debate though that, like last year might have been an indication, and the fact that they're pretty much returning the same team, you know, I think they've already kind of fallen off, but if there is a fall off, like that's another team I would watch too.
It's funny, Damian Lillard really wanted out of Portland. He finally gets the move, and I don't really think he's in a great position there. Look, the NBA
Oh,
season is right here. A lot of contending teams, a lot of star players like Giannis and Dame Lillard on the Bucks, like a lot of the guys we have mentioned here currently. It is going to be a very, very fun NBA season. Which team do you see capturing the 2024-25 NBA championship?
I'm just gonna say that the Boston Celtics are gonna repeat. We haven't had a repeat in a while. I think they could be built for it. I think the chip on their shoulder is there. Um, I'm just gonna go with it. I don't believe it. I'm not gonna say it with my chest. I'm just gonna say it because it's early in the season. It's the start of the season, and they of anybody would be the most ready-made to do it. So I'm gonna say they repeat. We haven't had one in a while. The NBA is loaded with repeat champions throughout its history, and I think we're just due for one, and they're set up to do it.
I completely agree. I don't know if I do have the Celtics winning it. You guys will hear my prediction on the episode, on a future episode of this podcast pretty soon. I think we'll come out on the exact same day as we near the NBA season, but I'm not going to share it here for my audience. But I think something along those lines of Boston possibly repeating with the roster that they have, the coaching and everything. I thought losing Ime Udoka a few years ago would hurt them, but I think they're a championship ready team. We saw that last year. They have a chip on their shoulder. They're going to prove it again. But none of us are going to be able to play in the NBA. None of us will be able to be in the shoes, or I guess you never know. Someone listening to this could be in the shoes of a future Boston Celtic, but obviously me and you won't. I am an aspiring sports broadcaster. Being someone like you in this industry would be absolutely amazing. Now I get to speak with you. Thank you so much for coming on. If you had to give one piece of advice to an aspiring sports broadcaster like myself, what would it be and why?
My advice to you would be keep doing what you're doing, because, and I'm not saying this because I'm on with you. You're very impressive.
Thank you.
And that's a big start to this, because what you're doing is extremely smart. You're getting reps right now. That doing this podcast, doing your Wizards podcast, the Orioles stuff, like this is what you do. And I tell everybody this, whether it's high school kids, college kids, anybody that wants to be in this business, I tell them all the same thing. Get reps in. And it doesn't matter who's listening, how many, it doesn't matter, because this is basically what players do in the gym. They work on shots. They get themselves ready so that when an opportunity comes up and it is your time, you're ready for it because you've done it over and over again. You have your verbiage, you have your voice developed, you have your mannerisms, all the things that you want to do. It's already built in because you've been working on your craft. You are just like an athlete, and you have to have that athlete mentality. So I say that all the time. Now, the main piece of advice, though, beyond this, because this is exclusive to you, that's why I said keep doing what you're doing. But the main piece of advice I always give people, because this is my career in a nutshell, is I always tell everybody that when your first opportunity comes, whenever it does, don't look at it and say, oh, that's it. Oh, that's so small time. Nobody cares about that. Nobody's going to be what? No, it has nothing to do with the audience. It has to do with how much you put into it. Because I promise you, a saying in basketball is the ball finds energy. What that means is that the player on the court who is doing the most, the ball's going to come to you because you're just doing so much. You're running around, you're moving around, your effort level's high. So the example I give is I was a sports writer. I was part-time out of college. I didn't have my name in the newspaper. I did nothing. Like, it was taking phone calls and writing little blurbs about high school sports. My name wasn't there. Nobody knew I was working for a newspaper. But I one day wanted to be an actual sports writer with my name in the paper, with the bylines and all that stuff. When I got my first chance to write a story in the sports section, the first story I ever wrote was a high school badminton story. Now, when I told my friends, like, I'm going to get my first byline tomorrow. Oh, yeah, what are you doing? What are you writing about? Badminton. Of course, my friends are laughing at me. They're like, are you serious? Like, this is where your career's going? This is what you're doing? You know, like they had all kinds of nicknames. Like, you can imagine how that went.
Yeah.
But I looked at it like, I don't care. This is my first byline. I want to crush this. So I went to the high school. I covered it. It was 300 words. It wasn't even a big story. But I'm telling you, I wrote that like it was game 7. Mattered to me. And I put a lot of energy and passion in it. But what do you know? Who's reading a story like that, Chase? Who's reading that story?
Not a lot of people.
But who is, though?
People who love badminton.
Parents of the players on the team, right?
Right.
Because as a dad, I can tell you, only a parent will read a story like that because you want to hear about your kid's team, right? So parents called the newspaper asking for extra prints of it and also commenting to the editor about that was such a well-written story. It was so much like it was such a great story. Like they really appreciated the effort I put into it, the energy I put into it, the enthusiasm that I had in a story. And so from there, the editor said, you did a good job. People really liked it. How about you do another one? And really in the end, isn't that what we're trying to do? In this job, what you're trying to do is just get another opportunity. And so that's why the best advice I give anyone is no job is too small. And you never know who's reading, who's watching, who's listening. This right now, this podcast. You don't know who might come across and listen to this and go, hey, that Chase kid's pretty good. I gotta keep an eye on him, right? You never know, which is why you pour all your energy into it and treat everything that you cover as if it's the biggest thing going. Because you know what? In your life, in your career, at that moment, it is. So make sure you always have that.
Alan Hahn, thank you so much for that piece of advice, talking about your career, and thank you so much for coming on the show today, talking about the NBA and broadcasting. I think a combination of the two, I mean, this is what I love to do most, so we really appreciate you coming on, and we wish you the best of luck and all of the great things that you do throughout the NBA season and other seasons as well.
Thanks, Chase. This was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. I'd love to do it again sometime, but for now, we'll just enjoy the NBA season and enjoy all the great things that it has. I hope you guys, the audience, I hope you did enjoy this episode alongside an analyst for ESPN and MSG Networks, Alan Hahn. I'm your host, Chase Coburn, and we will see you next time right here from the Cool Sports Network. Take care.